what surprises me, it's incredible, especially to lean into it, was how much was going on back then. I cannot believe how much was happening, like from 80 to 83, 84. It's amazing. I'm like, man, listen, and literally, you don't miss the water till the well runs dry. So, things change, and I'm aware of that. But New York at that time, man.
Fab Five Freddy, welcome to Bullseye. So happy to have you on the show. So nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good to be on Bullseye with you guys. What's going on?
Fred, I think people have ideas about what Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, where you grew up, Bed-Stuy,
right,
is like or was like. Can you tell me what it was like for you when you were a kid in the 60s and early 70s?
Sure. Basically home. A predominantly brownstone community, actually. In fact, it may be the largest brownstone community in the city of New York, but it was just home for me growing up. Nice, working to middle class kind of Black families primarily.
One of the things you write about in your book is that there were folks in the neighborhood who owned their house. There were folks in the neighborhood who rented their house.
Correct.
And that was the class difference in the neighborhood was who had to rent.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, but it's funny for me because being that I remember when I was a little boy and older kids would say, oh, his father is the landlord. And I'd be like, what? I didn't know. They would say it so much like almost like as if that was something, well, why does my dad have to be the landlord? And you later learn that, most people were renting and a few people, that were homeowners or whatever. So it was somewhat differentiated when you have a huge community full of these basically one family homes that sometimes got converted into, multiple units or something like that. So yeah, somewhat the defining characteristic of the economic base of the community.
You had folks coming in and out of your house, right? Even your bedroom moved around.
Yeah, it did. And we had a pretty lively household. Thinking back, my dad had quite a bit of friends. We had family in the house. So it was a pretty lively scene. And particularly for my dad, he was like a beacon. So a lot of people came, guys that were into the stuff he was into would gather in the basement of our house, which was sort of like his man cave hangout. And it was a lot going on at the time. I'm a kid playing with G.I. Joe. I used to always like to think, but a lot was happening at that time. Upheavals, people challenging the system and, fighting for change, civil rights, anti-war, a lot of that stuff was going on. They were very concerned and on top of a lot of that stuff.
Your folks were an accountant and a nurse. Your father was an accountant?
Yes, he was. Yeah, my dad was an accountant. My mom was a nurse. But I guess, I had other friends I would meet later whose parents were like similar, but my dad was very kind of open-minded, cannabis using, jazz listening, so it was kind of a bit of a kind of happening. They were very kind of intellectual, but also very, very hip and tapped in and plugged in the stuff that was going on. So a lot of that kind of rubbed off on me.
Did you look up to the jazz guys that were in your dad's life? Your dad had been childhood best friends with Max Roach, who's your godfather. Did you think they were the coolest?
I knew it was a big thing. It wasn't it grew to be more important to me, once again, along with, it's similar to my awareness of the serious things that went on as I was a kid, as I grew older. Max was like family, essentially, and I knew he was very important, but, we're so close. He was at the house often, hear stories, hear his music all the time. But as I grew to understand jazz more and more, understand it was very complex, if you will, as a young kid to be able to decipher these instrumental wizards. And one of the things that fascinated me really early on was how my dad and his friends could detect or, they would know who an individual musician was just by the way he played. I thought that was like unbelievable until you listen enough and I was like, oh yeah, that's Monk. Oh, that's Max.
Is graffiti your first memories of hip hop culture?
It's interesting because I guess in my book, I really break down the way what we know of as hip hop culture came to be. And I had a hand in that because it wasn't necessarily considered a part of hip hop culture in the beginning. It was just, I like to describe early graffiti in New York as just an adolescent teenage activity. It wasn't like every kid doing it was trying to be an artist. It was just a thing that was the thing to do among New York teenagers for a good period. It actually starts in the 60s and really goes crazy in the 70s into the 80s, if you will. It's New York graffiti, particularly the really wild, colorful murals that developed by the time they did develop. So yeah, it was something I was just into as an adolescent New Yorker, like thousands of other kids were. But
do you remember the first tag that you recognized? Like the first time you saw somebody up somewhere that you had seen somewhere else?
Yeah, it was a combination of things. So the A train was the local train that ran into my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And I began to see the names of these guys like Frank 207, SJK 171, Turok. And I was just like, what the hell is going on with these names and these numbers? You'd only see it on the A train because that was the local train. Then at the same time, there were guys that began to write their names on the walls in Brooklyn, which was a Brooklyn thing with a kind of a flamboyant style of writing. And I guess I got curious about this. And I guess one day I kind of took the A train to the last stop up to northern Manhattan, which is basically called Washington Heights. And it goes up into the 200s, like the 200th Street, if you will. And when I went up there, I got off the train and walked around and I saw all these guys' names that I'd seen on the A train a lot in the train station and on the walls. And I knew, oh, these guys live around here. And I think that was also when I figured out what the numbers represented, the streets that these guys lived on. So Frank 207 lived on 207th Street, SJK 171, 171st. These were all the guys in Washington Heights. And actually the kid that actually got graffiti going in that era, if you will, that really sparked it all off, was a Greek kid named Taki 183. And the story is he was a messenger in New York City then in the late 60s, and wherever he had to go and deliver packages, he would just tag his name up with a marker. It wasn't so much spray paint, but he really covered a lot of ground and his name was just everywhere. And that incited other kids to join in.
I mean, the thing about writing on trains is that trains travel, right? So a wall stays put, a train brings you everywhere.
Yes. And so as graffiti grew from what the, Taki started, it went to trains, it was buses, it was walls. Literally, New York City was largely covered top to bottom, inside out. It just became this thing that was so fascinating in retrospect, how pervasive it was. I mean, it was insane how that grew and became that. And I really think it's because a lot of us were kids in the 60s and had seen the protests and all the counterculture stuff that was going on, challenging the system and all of those things that made the 60s and a lot of the 70s that same thing.
What was the first thing that you wrote?
Oh, well, I had a name. I had a couple of different names when I was trying it out in Brooklyn. I wanted to have a name with a number. So I tried Showdown 177. I just thought those numbers look cool together. Once again, I'm in Brooklyn. There's no numbered streets in Bed-Stuy. And then I had another name was Bull, like the animal, 99. And that kind of caught on because buddies of mine all took, it was a crew of us. So then it was Herb 99. He wrote the same number. We were both like 99. And then there was another kid, Jake 77. So the double digit number thing became popular among a lot of our crew. And that was primarily wall writing, but then just tagging your name up on popular corners and the wall or whatever. But then when I went to high school, there was a train yard around the high school I went to, and I got some paint out of shop class, slipped under the fence and tagged up a train. I didn't even realize it was a train that was going to run through my neighborhood in Brooklyn, through the Bushwick, Williamsburg area, that elevated train. And my friends saw it and lost their mind. They went like, yo, and I was like, what are you talking about? It was insane. It was like I just, appeared on some TV show or whatever. It was just a weird thing that, got a lot of people going. They had questions because, you have to have other graffiti friends there was like a network of people that shared information about how and where to actually make this happen.
How old are we talking about when you first got up on the side of that elevated train?
I was in high school, so like, 14, 15, around there, like young teen, it's interesting because most of graffiti, it was a teenage thing. Like I said, adolescent teenage activity. By the time you hit 17, 18, now you got to start like, hey, now college, are you going to, you're grimy, you're dirty all the time, you're paint on your hands, chicks don't want, and it's like, wait. So a lot of guys would transition out of graph when they hit those late teens, touching early 20s, because you got to shift now into figuring out what you're going to really do in life.
What was the first big whole car paint, bubble letter characters, like the thing that people imagine when someone says, oh, New York City subway car covered in graffiti, that you remember seeing as a kid or a teenager?
Once again, it was a progression of it. You would see smaller pieces, what we call window down, which are pieces done from the window down, which are smaller pieces, but still they can be,
Still talking about 6, 8 feet wide, 10 feet wide sometimes.
Completely, yeah. The car is about 20 feet long, about 7 or 8 feet high. And so then you've got windows. So a window down pretty much meant that. The pieces from, like I did saw such and such piece, it was window down. Guys would say, or you do a whole car, which you mean cover the whole car. You've seen it develop to a point. And there were things that stood out. Being in Brooklyn, the heavy stuff was really going on in Manhattan. So you would hear about things. We would go to watch trains. There were places where you would go, like one popular station was Grand Concourse on 149th Street, where guys would gather there just to look at trains. It was a very popular train station, and graph guys went to hang out, meet each other, and watch trains. This is, once again, all stuff that went on back then. But I remember one particular train, this kid Flint 707 did, which I believe it was the first really accurate 3-dimensional, and it was like, it wasn't a complete top to bottom, but it was a big, giant Flint 707 that dominated like the center of the car and really big letters. But the drop shadow was perfect. So it was like nobody had figured out, like, how do you get this done and do it right? Some people had attempted, just making the name bigger, but then it was like, I'm going to make it bigger, but I'm going to get this. So it really has this 3-dimensional thing. And everybody was talking about, oh, you got to see this and, whatever.
I have a particular question for you, which is this. The graffiti world obviously was a multicultural one to some extent, but it was
very
a largely Black and Latino world. How did you feel about going to talk to a bunch of white people?
No problem whatsoever, as long as, if they were open to have conversations. And that was key for me, becoming a part of the underground new wave scene, the creative scene in New York at that time, which was largely white, but people were very progressive and very open to these ideas. So that was unique at the time, very special at the time. And I had a sense that it would be that, looking at what these new wave and punk rock bands were doing and talking about. It was some really wild, go against the grain stuff. I felt like they might, lend an ear to these things I talked about, and that panned out. So those were all, the first supporters and stuff, they were all white, but they were all like counterculture to the max and not down with like mainstream haters, if you will. They were very progressive and open and saw it, and somewhat outcasted in a way that a person of color might be as well, because they chose to wear their hair in a mohawk or to have crazy looking clothes before that was anywhere near fashion, So people came and lived in parts of New York City where it was about being different and doing different and not being uptight about somebody being gay or somebody being another ethnicity. You know what I'm saying? That was the camaraderie, and that drew a lot of people together back then. When you got into the mix, you realize, oh, it might be some people that were just or whatever, no matter what color, you know, that goes without saying. But for the most part, it was a community of people that were just open to cool stuff. And that turned out to be, the hunch I had turned out to be correct. And that's how we got things moving and got things rolling.
I heard you on The Breakfast Club talking about Andy Warhol, who was your friend when you were a young man, and talking about how you didn't even realize he was gay. You kind of thought of him as somebody that didn't date.
Yeah.
And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the way that the sort of fundamental queerness of that world, that downtown world at that time, you know, connected to dance clubs and the art world,
right,
was kind of part of what made it a welcoming environment for you, even as a straight guy, as a person of color in this weird place, that there were people who were there because they chose it to be a safe place for weirdos, including queer people of color who had come there because they needed safety for their queerness.
Right.
And that suffused the world that you were in. I mean, you write in the book about being out at clubs that were mostly gay.
Yeah, Paradise Garage and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the world of disco, which was deeply in conversation with hip hop. You know, the idea of extending records was like the central insight of hip hop, just like it was the central insight of disco. Yeah. You know, it was a very queer world. It was
a very queer world, and once again, I detail in the book how I learned, you know, coming up in Bed-Stuy, you know, guys were very homophobic, but a lot of it also was connected to, listen, we're probably going to end up in jail at some point. And one of the nightmare stories you'd hear about in jail was people wanting to rape and sexual assault. And guys that were really good with fighting you'd have to know how to fight, because if you lose, a lot of it was probably bullshit, but a lot of it was obviously true. So there was a thing that was very pervasive among ghetto heterosexual teens as you grew up. But as I, you know, decided to make moves to not be, you know, to go to the garage the first time, and, you know, you didn't have this kind of nonsense image that these guys are going to come and attack you or stuff like that. I was like, what do you mean? So quickly learned to adjust and let people do their thing. And the fun thing about the Garage, which was a very gay club and one of the pioneering clubs in the whole, what became disco, even EDM, that so much grew out of what went on at that club. And then, you know, once again, Andy was very pioneering in terms of looking at people's counterculture lifestyles or whatever, and putting a frame around them in ways that society was nowhere near ready to at that time. These things are now normal. We have like mainstream TV shows, although now under this political climate, there's different people that, you know, transgender people are sometimes being attacked and stuff. But Andy did so much to kind of bring literally those kind of things out of the closet, so to speak, which is pretty remarkable when you look back at all of that.
We've talked a lot without talking about music, and Brooklyn, where you grew up, was not the center of hip hop music at the very beginning. So how did you learn about what initially DJs and then later DJs and MCs were doing in other parts of New York City as they sort of trickled to Brooklyn?
Yeah. So I guess as a young teen, I would go to the local disco DJs would play in the parks in the summer, block parties, which you typically have on weekends in the, you know, urban communities. And hot DJs, these names became, and then they would oftentimes advertise their parties on this radio station I listened to a lot as a kid, WBLS, on the Frankie Crocker show. So I was aware of this, but I wasn't really deeply in the mix. But the mobile disco DJ was a huge thing in the city. that then leads to this rap thing developing, which was kind of like an alternative way to, it was a very interesting dynamic that then hip hop is kind of a spin-off, if you will, of what the disco scene had been for quite a while. Kool Herc definitely set that off in the Bronx. But yeah, man, going to these park jams in Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy and other parts of Brooklyn is how you first got to feel the energy of, like, just the idea of a DJ with 2 turntables and the music never stopped. Like, I go back to when that was like the hugest thing ever. Like, because typically most people had a thing where they'd put several 45s on a thing and on a record player, and the automatic mechanism would drop a record down, the arm would come, play the record, the arm would pick up, drop another record down. It was like, that's how you listen to music until this 2 turntable thing and the DJ can mix it. So I was aware of how revolutionary and innovative that was as a kid, just going to these park jams, and my ears were tuned to the hottest music. And then I began to hear something different that the DJs put on that really caught my attention. And I first went up to one of these guys and asked, "Yo, what is that?" And he was like, "Oh, this is the Uptown sound." It's like, "What is that?" Man, I got to find what this Uptown sound is, man. I want to know more.
When did you start to think about these different cultural elements that were just like stuff people in New York City around your age were up to?
Yeah.
I'm talking about the music, the writing, the dance, beatboxing, rapping.
Mm-hmm.
When did you start to think of those as being a group of things that stuck together?
Yeah. Well, I had seen an article, in one of my dad's publications or whatever, and I didn't know for many years who had written this, but I found out it was Albert Murray, who was this kind of, it's like a thought leader, the Black community, from the Black arts movement, whatever. I need to get some more Albert Murray stuff to really, dive in. But anyway, in an essay, he had said that for a culture to be complete, it should have a music, a visual art, and a form of dance. And this is as I'm now making this connection between this graffiti painting and like pop art, or following that, which had just happened really in the 60s, pop art, and how this graffiti thing, as graffiti writers, making their names brighter, bigger, more colorful, adding cartoon characters, we were clearly looking at similar stuff, and it basically was like, okay, well, there's this music, there's this visual art, and this type of dance. And I just said, well, if we could showcase these things and, make this argument that this is that culture that you really don't know about, that's been going on right under your nose.
I mean, your whole career has been going around with this stuff that you're so passionate about, pulling these pieces together, pulling people together, and turning them into a story through any form that you can get your hands on, whether it's wild style or MTV Raps or gallery work or whatever you can reach.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that has been a part of it, if you will. I mean, I guess somewhat kind of selfish, because like I said, I wanted to prop up a space so that I can be a painter. And then I did, just me and the canvas creating. I mean, it took off. I mean, it was crazy. In some cases, beyond expectation. Like, I had these ideas. We wanted to get this stuff moving, do all these things that I wanted to do. But it was like, well, I felt like if we get this out there, some people would connect with it. I didn't know a very prestigious Italian art dealer was going to be the one that said, yes, I agree with this. We're going to give you guys a show at our gallery in Rome. I was like, okay, which was way beyond expectation and stuff like that. And so there's been a lot of really great benefits along this journey, if you will, that have been quite surprising, but had definitely, worked to put fuel on the fire at critical points, and to, bring other people to the table. It's just really amazing that some of these things were able to come together in the way they did.
You've been telling your own story since you were a teenager. Like, that's part of what you've done all along, right? You're finding ways to communicate your own story in the world that you're in. But now you have written a book about your life.
Yeah.
And I wondered what surprised you when you looked at it from this perspective.
Oh, boy. I tell you, what surprises me, it's incredible, especially to lean into it, was how much was going on back then. I cannot believe how much was happening, like from 80 to 83, 84. It's amazing. I'm like, man, listen, and literally, you don't miss the water till the well runs dry. So, things change, and I'm aware of that. But New York at that time, man, like the different cultural music, the various things going on. You can go to like 3 or 4 different clubs every night and an after-hour spot. An amazing world that, and it had its ups and downs. It was grimy. People were like, throwing their fist in the air, fighting for like a better, chance at it all. But the fun and the excitement and just people's openness to just, check out new things and dance to new rhythms was so phenomenal and so amazing. And it's shocking that it's completely different now. Which is just, you go, wow, man, it was such an incredible ride. And I'm so happy that I got to, put a lot of this down on the page, because like in working on it and then getting all the dates right in the timeline, I'm like, wait a minute, dude, this is crazy, But it was so much fun and it was such a blast. And to see that we're still living in the afterglow or the residual effects of all this, is the fact that rap is still, even though rap just evolves and goes through, it's still one of the most listened to musics. It's really incredible that this stuff got so big and pervasive, it's like.
Freddy, I cannot imagine a better ambassador for fun and wildness and the enjoyment of creation than you in this book. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah, thanks for having these great questions. And it was great to be here with you guys. And this is so dope. Everybody's fly. If you're fly, you better get that book, baby.